Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in the GLS series of masterclasses. Today we'll be dealing with legal template management, and our presentation will be administered by Mr. Matthew Glynn, Chairman of GLS. Before we get started, a couple of quick house rules. Can I please ask that you ensure that you keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation, so that we can preserve the audio quality. Also, if you do have any questions, they are very much encouraged, but please just submit them through the chat function, and we will then ask the questions at the end, and Matt will respond at that time. Final point to note is that this presentation is being recorded, and that a video of it will be published on the GLS website within 24 hours of the presentation being finished. And with that, I'll hand over to Mr. Matthew Glynn. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for everyone joining this GLX Legal Ops community event. This topic is actually one of our favourites to be sharing with the community, as it's an area where in-house leaders can make such a obvious, such a measurable improvement to the business that they support, that the business is going to love. Optimizing your legal template assets is something that every business would like to see happen, and there's a lot of internal users who are crying out for better templates that are easier to work. So this session's all about calling out the features of a best practice template library and how you can efficiently manage that into existence with some very different kind of thinking that I hope will resonate, and certainly is the drivers of the work that we do. So let's jump right in. For many teams, the management of a legal template library proves to be particularly challenging. In fact, less than a quarter of the legal teams that we deal with are satisfied with the current state of their legal template library. Most, and as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, including the internal users, the internal clients, have a really long list of complaints. In fact, take your pick as to what those complaints actually might look like. As you can see there, hopefully some will resonate and will be concepts you'll be familiar with in your own legal team ecosystem. So for the in-house counsel, in our view, they typically enjoy a love-hate relationship with their legal templates. Most lawyers, if you're certainly like any lawyer at GLS, are detail and perfection orientated, and that clumsy clause that everybody has to deal with, that poorly formatted document, and those inconsistencies across the library are an irritant, at best, and literally a source of grinding gears at worst. In-house lawyers know that they can fix these problems, of course, if they had time. In-house lawyers know the value of a great template library. It's unquestionable. They drive business enablement. They can, in the context of a large MNC, save tens of thousands of hours per year as contract closure times improve, as the templates improve. And the net result is that legal teams, if they're working from an improved legal template library, free up their time to do other things. But no, for many in-house legal teams, more than 75%, the template library remains that untended garden whose potential remains largely hidden. And yet, upgrading the template library remains, in our view, and consistently across our client base, a top 5 project for in-house leaders that they'd like to do. The task itself is actually quite complex, it's detailed, and it's time-consuming. And even as legal teams are embracing the plethora of CLMS, that's automated contract management lifecycle systems, that are, the hope and the efficiencies that they offer, template libraries still remain on the to-do list. And operating a CLMS with a bad template library is pretty much like running, Coca-Cola in your new BMW and expecting it to work. But all of this said and done is actually quite understandable. And it's understandable because the in-house community suffers a rather unique phenomenon called too busy to find time to do the things that help them become less busy. And as a result, template projects, along with so many other things the in-house team would like to be doing and know they should be doing, just remains another project to be done in the following year. So, possibilities. What if you and your team could access some powerful efficiency hacks or concepts that makes this job of managing a template library upgrade far less intimidating? What if you could leverage the anatomical features of the way in which a contract is constructed such that it massively descopes the works that are required? What if you could then combine this with some essential design features and then marry it all together with established best practices around template library construction, use, and maintenance? Would this be helpful? In our view, it's always helpful to the in-house community, and that's what today's session is all about. So let's take a quick look about what we're going to cover. Firstly, we're going to establish some North Stars, and we're going to address the question as what's a definition, what's a working definition that we can use of a best practice template library? We're then going to enter the matrix in which the humble contract resides and explore some anatomical and conceptual features that we know can drive efficiency, but perhaps may not have been on your radar in terms of concepts you can work with. Once having debunked a few myths associated with the contract itself, we're going to explore some basic design features of what a best practice library looks like for you to consider. And then we're going to wrap up the session by way of a conclusion that is actually an aggregation of 15 key operational principles that'll govern how you develop and how you manage and maintain your best practice template library. So let's jump in with that first question of what is a best practice template library? Okay, so what is best practice when it comes to managing legal templates that support your business inside your organization? Is there such a thing? What's the right answer? Well, firstly, let's just not get too hung up on the concept of best practice. We only use this in the context of this session and at GLS generally to offer a model or a series of reference points that can become a target that allow you to orientate your efforts to achieve your own version of optimized outcomes from your legal templates. It's important that I flag this up because every ecosystem does have different skills, different cultures, different policies, competencies. It serves different geographies, etc. So there is no one size fits all. Your template library solution must be socialized to the specifics to your environment, enable the outcomes that your specific business seeks. So the shortest answer is, of course, at the end of the day, a best practice template library is whatever works for you. Now, whilst this is inarguably true, it's a bit fluffy, and as we're not running for political office, we need to give a better answer than one that keeps everybody happy. So let's look at a more definitive answer that we use at GLS. Now, the best practice template library is most certainly not just a bunch of documents. The working definition that we use is that it's an organized set of contracts and related assets that, I'm going to go through 5 salient features here, that enable your business to do business in a legally and compliant manner. It has to be efficient and effective. It must perpetually improve. And an additional 5th requirement that any in-house leader simply must factor in. It must be, these templates must be ready for technology leverage. So for us, a best practice template library is a library. Okay. For those, depending on your age, you may remember a library to be a big building in your local neighborhood with books inside it. Depending on your age, that may or may not resonate. But the library is a library of contract-related resources that drives high performance inside your business. Thus, templates are actually pretty important to every business, including yours. Now, there are 2 concepts in this working definition that we're going to spend a bit of time on during this session. The first is library, and the second is the notion of high-performing contracts. And we're going to unpack each of these themes as a sort of a golden thread that runs through the balance of the session. Okay, so a best practice template library is definitely not just a bunch of documents. It's more than that. It's an organized set of records. Let's now jump in. And despite all of those call out features about it being business enabling and the like, what we saw from the opening slide is that far too many in-house teams, in spite of the importance of the template and what it can bring, are not managing to optimize their template libraries. So do you want the red pill, right? And enter a matrix where you can see that optimizing template libraries are actually quite manageable, or the blue pill, and you can end your time with our session today, where the best practice template upgrade project just remains something on your to-do list. I'm assuming everybody wants the red pill. That's why they registered for this session. So for the balance of this session, what we're going to do is to introduce you to three things. Firstly, we're going to demystify the challenges associated with managing a template library, right, by giving you a series of perspectives on the contract and the contracting process, okay? Perspectives on the contract and the contracting process. Then we're going to unpack the core design features of a best practice template library so that you can have something to aim for and it can influence your effort to create your own libraries or upgrade your own libraries. And then finally, we're going to finish off by exploring those 15 key design principles. Okay, so the first step is to explore the first key element of a best practice template library, which is the contract itself. So let's take a quick look at what it is and why it's important. Now, obviously, we're not going to bore you with notions of a contract is in fact a written agreement between two parties prefaced on offer, consideration, and acceptance and the like. No, we can do better than that. Okay, the contract is more than that. It's a strategic corporate instrument that allows you to enable business. It's a manifestation of policy, and it's a driver of efficiencies. So for a best practice precedent library, right, high performance contracting is going to deliver through contract plus contracting, right? So obviously complex, your precedent library can be quite complex. It can be shaped by the number of templates, the time spending negotiation, the money you might be spending on law firms, the feedback you get from users, or it could be not complex, right? Which is the view that we want to advocate and share with you, and hence the reference to the matrix. So do you recall that moment in the Matrix where Neo ceased to be an actor in someone else's world and he became a director in his own? He could magically see the source code of things, which meant he was capable of incredible force multiplying things. We actually believe that the effective management of your template library can be efficiently achieved by looking at the source code of contract and contracting itself, correctly and more efficiently conceptualizing the nature of contract and contracting. So if we can get an understanding of the true anatomical nature of contracts and the contracting process, it has profound implications on the template library design and usage. It's going to allow you to, without too much effort, release a significant number of efficiencies into your organization. So just as a sort of scene setter straw poll, could I invite everybody to just punch into the chat, if they wouldn't mind, how many templates do you think that your legal team sort of notionally currently has in its contract template library? Nick, can you yell out the results as they come through?
Sure.
50. Mute. Most organizations tend to have anywhere between, anywhere in excess of 50, and many organizations can, depending on the age which they've been operating, can have literally hundreds. Okay, so what we want to do is to challenge the proposition that organizations need so many templates, and that hence to do that we enter the matrix. Now, the 101 record of what a contract is, the traditional answer of was a record of an agreement, but we say no, it's more than that. It's a strategic corporate instrument. The strategic corporate instrument that's going to allow you to reflect your corporate objectives, the policy infrastructure inside your organization, the procedures by which you operate, the typical contract of which so many of us have indicated they have a plentiful supply of. It's responsible for risk management. It determines real resource allocation inside of your organization. It drives fulfillment, productivity and delivery. It's key to business enablement, which I covered that, saves you money, and it can actually also drives market reputation. We've seen many organizations who have sort of shifted the market perception of them being difficult to deal with, have upgraded the way they develop and deploy their templates so that they become far easier to deal with. So what this means is that obviously the templates are important, but why do we need so many? So we're going to give you a couple of different perspectives in terms of how many different contract types we think there are. There are a couple of ways you can answer this question. The first answer is, well, there are really only two types of contracts, okay? There are long ones and there are short ones. Now, how you draft a short agreement is necessarily different from how you'll draft a long one. Length has consistent implications for contract content, the details which you include, the layout, the positions of clauses, etc. But fundamentally, there really are only two types of agreements. What we say is that the in-house team must leverage this perspective. Whilst some might refute this, the principle is irrefutable if you are talking about and focus on the 80% of agreements that you typically look at, not the one-off contract that you got sucked into to comment on and deal with aviation fuel forward derivatives, okay? That's not an everyday scenario that makes up your 80%. But let's go further in the matrix in terms of our search for economic and efficiency principles. Let's take a look at the procurement function. Now, we meet companies that literally have hundreds of supporting templates, but why? Okay. In fact, the biggest project that we've ever worked on involved some 380 agreements, and we just couldn't understand why. And they felt it was essential. They needed nuanced variances of everything. But what if we looked at it in a different perspective? What if we looked at just one second, what if we looked at it through the perspective of procurement relationship status? Okay. And if you looked at it through the perspective of procurement relationship status, there's really only two scenarios. Okay. There's one and dones, or single use. That's where you contract with that party on a one-off basis. And in that relationship construct, that usage construct, you might use a long form, you might use a short form, you might just use your PO-based terms and conditions approach, okay? But within the one and done, there's only three different variants. But then you have relationships with parties where it's going to be ongoing, like a multi-use scenario. But even then, there's still only two types, okay? We have master services agreements or frameworks, or if you're clever with the keyboard, arguably just one. So our entire need for contracts when looking through the procurement lens is framed by only two scenarios and at most just 5 agreement types. So why then do procurement teams end up having so many different agreements if effectively they're not needed? Well, let's go a little bit deeper into the matrix and let's explore some of the anatomical features of the commercial contract and see what that offers by way of efficiencies. Specifically, we're going to look at what we call at GLS the carbon principle, which has massive implications for the production and maintenance of your templates. So this is a really, really big tip that we want you to take home, okay? 70 to 75% of every single commercial agreement is the same, no exceptions, okay? Carbon, hence the name, hence we use it, is the element that's found consistency in all forms of life on Earth and is an apt name for what we call the build features of a contract. And the build features in a contract is found in every single agreement, including even those drafted by our American colleagues. Okay. The build includes boilerplate. So 25% of every agreement is boilerplate, which is the same. Your organization should have your own version of boilerplate. Interpretation, a very small part of the agreement, but it just tells us how definitions, etc., are going to be construed. Definitions themselves, jumping down to the D, comprises typically around 15% of the word count of agreement. And then legal risk, those 6 provisions that are the primary arbitrators of risks, the liability, the indemnity, the payment, the reps and warranties, etc., that is usually only 25% of the agreement at most. And then the balance, someone can check the maths on this, but it's a 70-75%, build proposition that we posit here. The balance is actually the specific provisions that give any template its subject-specific nature. So if it's a services, it will be services performed in accordance with service levels, and the people performing the services will be wonderful, etc. Okay, so your contract build for all your standard commercial agreements, and again, it's the 80%, and I've got a specific slide on this, really should be the same if you are applying consistent group legal policy and you're committed to leveraging the efficiencies of standardization in a way that we're sharing with you today. To be clear, okay, a notice provision, whether you want notices delivered by smoke signal or carrier pigeon, for your organization, it should be the same in every agreement. Your approach to anti-bribery and corruption should be the same in every agreement that you produce. So why should it ever differ in any of your templates? So this is a really, really big tip. If you can master your organization's build, you have immediately 70% of any contract template that you are ever likely to need. Okay. I'm just going to pause there for 1 second. And I'm hoping if I just drag this screen onto the slide deck. Nick, are you able to see that document?
Yes, bright and clear.
Okay. All right. So I just want to demonstrate something for you. So here at GLS, right, whenever we're working with a client, and all too often what we build for clients is, as a first step, is a very, very powerful means of them harnessing their build. This is the build that we use at GLS. There's over 300 clauses there. Every standard clause for every different type of law we have. But inside this build, right, reflective of the group legal policy that we advocate, let me just drag that down a little bit. I've got a, right. We are able to literally put in here, if I wanted a liability clause, right, up comes my liability clause. And there you go, so you can see it. And then a preview of my clause comes here. I drag that liability clause there, and hey ho, presto, there's my liability clause, in this case, defects liability clause, entered straight into there. I offer that just as a tangible view of the ability with legal teams can combine the concept of carbon in a contract, the build, which reflects your group legal policy, with $10 of technology, $10 on a license fee per month, and they can instantly access their build. So you could think of the challenges that you've wiped out from this challenging concept of challenge rather of, that's 3 challenges, 1 sentence, apologies about that. Think of the challenges you can wipe out in terms of building templates and manage them if you're able to access your build and your build is constantly maintained and nurtured. It's phenomenal. But let's go further. Let's shift our perspective once again and explore the efficiencies based on our ability to negotiate. And our ability to negotiate actually does require a little bit of reflection. Are we big enough such that we can assert our own paper, or are we on the receiving end? In terms of your major types of contracts, you need to profile it. And the way in which we recommend is as follows. If we look through the lens of negotiability profile, right, there are only ever going to be 4 types of contracts that our legal template library must be prepared for and that we as in-house teams are actually going to encounter. Agreements where our negotiation position is strong and where we can use our own paper. They're scenarios where we need our own templates. So if you look at the top left, right, the not negotiable, that could be our purchase orders as an example. We send it to the counterparty and we say, sign here. In other scenarios where we have sufficient negotiation clout, but where we do expect sensible negotiation on those usual, half dozen points that everybody has the right to provide feedback, we can start with our own paper, but we need to sort of bend left or right or up or down on a range of points. All parties receive the equivalent of our not negotiables. So if you're ever dealing with the likes of Microsoft or SunGard, it's simply sign here, don't care what you have to say. And then finally, there are totally bespoke templates. It might be you're building a power plant or something like that, and everything's just built ground up from one lead party and commented on by others. So when you look through the negotiation profile, what is it telling you about your template library? Well, you don't need this because you don't know what they are. You don't need that because you don't, but you do need something to address it. So maybe you need a checklist to be built in your library to deal with that scenario. For your purchase order, non-negotiables, you're definitely going to need that to prepare that on your paper. And you're going to need those templates where you are the dominant force, but you need to be slightly negotiable. Okay. So that's just another way of viewing that. But here's the point around that. Okay. Here's the point around all of this. Okay. There is simply no need for most in-house legal teams to have as many templates as they do. And the idea that they try and accommodate templates for every scenario is the road to ruin. 75% of all templates, 70 to 75% of all templates are essentially the same for which we can pre-prepare. If we look at it through the relationships that we have with vendors in the context of procurement, there's only 2 types, of which there are 5 varietals. If we look at it through the lens of negotiation strength, there's only 4 types. And as we said at the top of this section, there's only two types of contracts, long and short. So with that, we conclude that there is an underlying and inherent simplicity around how you can conceptualize the legal template. And as such, there should be some efficiencies that follow. So here comes our next big tip, and it relates to the template production and maintenance itself. If you want a healthy tree, it's always been more efficient to maintain is it more efficient to maintain the individual leaves on the tree, or is it more efficient to maintain the root system? Okay. Obviously, good overall health comes from maintaining optimal roots, right? The same principles apply for the production and maintenance of the 80% scenario of templates that you need in most new business. If you focus on them, you can achieve the same efficiencies by optimizing these concepts. There really is only 2 types of contracts, long ones and short ones. So maybe we just have a long form and a short form build. We know that there's never going to be more than 5 contract species, okay? We know there's the purchase order, the one and dones, the MSAs, etc. We know that if we get the build right, then 70 to 75% of any contract that we need to prepare is going to come together really, really quickly. And we know that if we focus our efforts on those limited contracting scenarios where we can assert our own paper, then we drastically reduce the effort it takes to create and maintain a template library by focusing on those limited number of concepts. So think of the principle of a tree. If we're ensuring that roots are nurtured, then the tree will be healthy. Now, the answer to the question in terms of how many precedents is optimal for most legal departments, there is no specific answer. But for your average corporate, if you were to have any more than 30 templates inside your legal template library, then it's suggestive and indicative of a departure from principles that are going to make the maintenance of your library efficient. Okay, so that's just a rule of thumb. Anything more than 30 is unnecessary, and you probably haven't segmented your need for contracts more robustly enough so that, categories of spend in the case of procurement are adequately you don't need 17 different types of services agreement. You never have, and you never will. Okay. You don't need, 10 different types of goods agreements, etc. So effectively, the maximum number of precedents that we think that a legal team should ever have, right, bar extenuating circumstances, is around 30. We're ruling out, we're not including in that if you're an MNC operating globally, that, you might need one that's subject to, you might need a template capable of being used in different jurisdictions. But does that require you need a separately maintained template? We'd argue no. Okay, so I've just given you a bit of an example of the GLS clause bank. So as an organization, by maintaining our one single clause bank, we have simultaneously been able to maintain 70 to 75% of every single precedent that we use. Okay, and we do the same for our clients. Now, if you add some sensible legal tech into the mix, as I've just demonstrated, then obviously, tending to your agreements and in fact creating new agreements becomes really quite easy. Okay, now I just want to reinforce this point again. The single biggest mistake that in-house teams make is thinking that because they use something on a deal and it seemed to work quite well, let's just chuck that into the library. Okay, you simply do not need to build template libraries for 100% of your contracting needs. You have to and you must only ever build it for up to 80% of what you use most often. Okay, not what the biggest ticket of spend is, but what you use most often. If you defy this rule of the matrix, and you'll find yourself rapidly beginning to experiencing the law of diminishing returns, and a library that in not too distant future will collapse and cease to be a repository of corporate assets. Okay, so the focus here is focus on the 80%, because if you've developed your build, you know that anytime an outlier scenario actually comes up, it's probably going to be, a bespoke project, but you've already got your 70% of that agreement ready to go. So accommodate up to 80% at the most of what your legal team needs. And accommodating anything more than that is largely unnecessary and a departure from the carbon principle. Okay, so now that we have these foundational principles or anatomical observations of the contract, let's see, or let's explore together the feature set that comes from a best practice template library. So jumping straight into that, the library, as it's traditionally understood, is set out on the left. The library is typically referred to as the memory of mankind. Libraries have been driving mankind for thousands of years. The Dewey Decimal System is 151 years old. The most successful legal template libraries operate precisely like your neighborhood community library. And so as you structure your plans for your own template library, it's really helpful to have that community library in mind. The community library has a purpose. It's to educate mankind. Well, in the legal realm, obviously the purpose of our library is going to be to drive high performance contracting. The library has members. The legal team has users. The library has books. We're going to have templates plus. When you go into the library, there are rules. You can't make noise in this area. We have a contract process rule to follow. The library has a building. Well, the template is also housed in a library, and increasingly it's an electronic form library in the form of CLMSs. Inside the library, there's a help desk. Inside your template library, there must be function help tools. Instead of the librarian we obviously have a knowledge manager or someone who's responsible for this asset inside the legal team. Now, taking that forward in terms of how that helps us come up with a best practice sort of framework for developing a library, we start off with the objective, right? We leverage in on the library concept. We're going to look specifically at users, the tools they need, the rules inside the library, training, maintenance concepts. principles of the best practice library and some performance features. And also we're going to quickly look at quality assurance and the CMS element. Okay, so feature one, high performance contracts. We've actually covered much of this. Contracting needs to be business enabling. Okay, so if the purpose of a contract is to be business enabling, you need to understand precisely what the requirements are of your business to ensure that your contracts perform well. That might sound obvious, but it's a question that we see too many companies, particularly North American companies, coming out in the Southeast Asian market and also into the Middle East, seem to forget. So if your objective is you're a fast-moving consumer goods business, right, and you're based out of the States, turning up into Indonesia or Oman with a long-form US-style document, right, is really not going to help you enable business because it's going to choke, right? The business custom is not to have those kind of documents. So I just offer that as an example where you need to think more than just sort of superficially about what business enabling means. Templates need to be calibrated to the context in which they're going to be used, right? If they're going to deliver that better, faster, cheaper performance output. Feature two is your library must serve the needs of the users. Looking through the lens of the users, you find that there are three major categories, all who must be accommodated. You have support users, okay? So that's procurement, contract administrators, and even vendors in the sense that they have to work with your paper if they want to come into your supply ecosystem, okay? They don't draft them, they just use them. You have cameo users, right? You can see that lawyers are in that group. And this is because if the templates are correctly built and the support tools are deployed, the need for the lawyer in relation to progressing that template is greatly reduced. And then we have a sort of catch-all bucket of user depending on your organization, which we call others. And what do these users want from their library solution? Well, having done hundreds of projects to upgrade the template library, here are some common design requests that we get, okay? Consistently in every organization, all users want robust libraries. They want libraries that are easy to navigate, that are filled with simple and standardized templates that themselves are easy to navigate, that they get training on, and that ultimately drives better and faster, cheaper outcomes. But if we look a little bit deeper into sort of omnipresent requirements that have impact on design, library content. So they don't actually just want templates. They also want tools that contain the how-tos, what to use, when to use, playbooks, etc. The structure of your template library must be such that it's near on impossible to find the wrong template. If anybody has confusion around what template to use, then there's a design issue with your template library. Okay, and this has particular implications for those who are calibrating their CLMS systems. Training, loudest call. They want to be trained on the actual assets that they're going to have to deploy. They need those rules. They want clarity about what to use and when. But critically, they also want confidence that the library is good to go and it's been maintained. And this is something that many, many legal teams, certainly 75% or more, are not able to actually sign off on. Users want template libraries that actually help them deliver on their job role. Okay, it drives job role outcomes. So it empowers them, it leverages them, it gives them access to experience, it makes things easier for them to do the job. So when you're thinking about what to include for the different user categories, how's this template going to use? So if somebody's responsible for consumable procurement inside of your organization, you can't give them a long-form Tolstoy-esque purchase order, a purchase agreement for goods, right? It needs to be calibrated to that particular audience. These are all, and then finally, in terms of those additional accoutrements, and it's somewhat repetitive, but the accoutrements, and it's not just libraries and documents, they also want support resources, just as you'd get inside your local library, right? So the best practice library is going to offer training modules, which are increasingly and more commonly now in a digital form. So a short little, this is how you use this template, this is what you fill out here and where. Tools and rules, knowledge of what to use, how and when, but also the ability to participate and shape how that library develops further based on experience. So if this happened on this deal, it's happening more often. Maybe we need a position, we need a process by which coalface feedback can be rearticulated back into the library and work its way back into not just templates, but also tools. So these are really important design considerations required by the user. And it needs to be afforded paramount importance in terms of design. In terms of what goes into your library, I'll try and just pick up the pace a little bit on this because these slides will be available. Right, we've made them intentionally detailed so that you can still get the import of what we discussed by reading the slides. There's two forms. There's the primary content, which is the actual contracts, and then the secondary content, which is supporting resources. There are three factors that determine what governs the primary templates you actually need. It's a down select process. So one is the contracting subject matter, and that usually covers, generic activities or mandatory agreement types your business, or agreements determine the nature of your business. And then two, once you have this universe of contracting subject matter types you need to address, you've got to down select, right? We've said it numerous times already, we don't want every conceivable template. Does that subject matter that you have identified, does it fall within that 80% of your contracting need by volume or by category spend if you're in procurement, okay? And if and only if it does, right? But particularly, weight the volume, how many times you use it, because each use will require some kind of human input if it's not optimized, and increasingly so. Then what kind of required varietal do you need, right? You need to decide what are those varietals of single use, multiple use, and then inside each of those what. So if we just go to the next slide, which will give us a bit of a breakdown of what that looks like. So let's just assume you've chosen the kind of content that you need. In this case, we've got examples of facilities management, goods or supply. You then need to decide, do you need the short version, long version, the PO, the frame, MSA, or actually does your negotiation profile such that you don't need your own paper, you just need a checklist? So you must apply the binary code that we've given you, the strategic assessment and characterization of your agreement. Apply the negotiation profile, stick to the 80%, and that'll tell you precisely whether or not you need that template. Okay, so feature 4, right, rules. Template libraries will never be effective without clear usage rules. And if you're any question about the veracity of that comment, think about your CLMS system. If you don't give it rules, it's not going to work. Okay, I'm going to speed through this slide, but effectively, the usage rules for your library is the usage rules. Well, what templates can be used? Okay, in what situation? Legal review requirements. If you are reviewing a template, well, the escalation procedures, review procedures, etc. Access rules, right? A big part, is everybody allowed into the rare historical book section, where gloves should be worn? Who can access the documents? Not every user should have access to every single document. Signing approval protocols, right? That's a feature of your rule. Obviously, it sort of crosses over into derogations of authority and all that kind of stuff. But there are also advanced rule sets that we just see deployed in really high-performing legal teams that have sort of complex need. People could have access to contracts based on their job role or what entity they're in and what kind of who the user is and what location they're in. And then we also see in some cases there's a user certification that somebody inside an organization can't actually negotiate agreement until they've been approved on it, a little bit like operating aircraft. And then obviously library editorial controls is something that we have to have a very strict protocol around to make sure that we know who can actually change an agreement, because you don't want people arbitrarily editing an agreement, certainly not one agreement and then not washing it through everything else. So that must be controlled. Of those rules, the first one, when to use and when it can be changed, is without doubt the most important rules. So feature 5 is about library location. This is a really interesting one. So most of us are probably not using a formal CLMS system. Those that have, most of us will have had some challenging experiences getting it up and running. But the library location obviously can be housed online. whether it's on a C drive, a SharePoint, or a CLMS. There are massive efficiencies to having something online, but what we want all of our GLS Legal Ops community to know, that for most legal teams, your SharePoint, assuming you're using it as most of you are, is more than good enough for most legal teams. Okay. The issue of CLMSs is not an easy one. That's really driven by, what do you do, what can it do, and do those two coincide, and then how you task it. But that really is just a subject for another day. CLMS discussions get quite complex. There's just a little bit of a visual there in terms of your precedent library and users and experience and guidance tools that all have to be configured into the CLMS platform. So feature 6, this is a bit potentially of a chewy slide, but it's one that we really do need to focus on. It's the issue of tools. So a template library, if we're going to have a holistic library that drives performance contracting, like that neighborhood library, can't just have books in it. We need to have more than that. So the key tool sets that you will find in a best practice template library context are as follows. So for tools, you're going to have playbooks, you're going to have clause banks, which I've demonstrated visually, smart schedules like pro forma schedules for each of the common scenarios you have, but they need to be prepared so that they can be completed in an intuitive fashion, ideally by the business themselves. How do you tackle third-party paper in the forms of checklists? You're going to have local law nuanced databases. I can tell you, in the case of Southeast Asia and the Middle East, there literally is not more than 8 concepts inside a commercial agreement that may change as a result of local law. So change from a standard, English law position that, most of us would be familiar with. So the notion that you can't develop templates that aren't applicable for use regionally, if not globally, is a nonsense. I X out China and places like that where, but they're outside of the 80%, so the rule still holds. Local law can be more than adequately dealt with by having a database of clauses that just plug in and fall out. Boilerplate library, okay, we've talked about that. You need to leverage the carbon principle. A definitions library, you need that. Clause banks, okay, approve for standard clauses, smart schedules, third-party paper, play books, local law nuances, etc. So these points just give a little bit more flesh on the bone to those. Now, feature 7, training. How much training should you be giving your user community in relation to your templates and the library itself? Well, without training, your template solution is really going to be like buying a plane that nobody knows how to fly. Okay, so in-house leaders uniformly tell us that their teams would benefit from more training. So your business has probably approved and allocated an external training budget, but what are they being trained in, right? What you need to do is organically develop your own training around your template library systems. And what it looks like really is that anyone that's going to work with your templates needs to have a basic training when they join the organization by way of induction. When? Well, with ongoing training, right? Because we advocate that ongoing refresher training should probably happen, 3 times per year. Now, whilst that seems excessive, right, when we come to the maintenance cycle, at least once per year, you're going to have to update your library, and there may well be updates. So obviously an optimal time for ongoing or refreshing training might be up to 3 times, but you could comfortably do it anywhere between 1 and 3, right? But we did say this was a best practice recommendation. Special training, right, in terms of training for there's a new law that's come through and necessitated a new type of agreement or something like that, so, or a new phenomenon. So at the moment with cybersecurity and data incident response, training in relation to that kind of template is quite helpful. So there's just some thoughts. There's some thoughts around training, and there's a nice little quote down there which says the only thing worse than training employees and losing them is to not to train them and keep them, which I think is quite good. And finally, in terms of maintenance, I've just called out a couple of key features of your template library, and called out, the frequency that we're actually advocating. There's nothing in here that's going to overwhelm you, but if you develop a playbook in terms of how to use your template, you need to, as a legal team, at least make one concerted effort to seek improvements of that. Okay. Definitions, you need to check that every year, because they can change. Most of it won't change. So, we're literally, in many cases, we're talking about, under an hour to complete these kind of reviews. Your boilerplate library, your legal landscape, regulatory changes, etc. So there's just for each, just noteworthy there in terms of your legal team users and your procurement team users, having an online survey, sort of just checking in on what kind of issues or improvements they might have, right? Using a desktop online survey where you can broadcast one to many and get feedback consolidated by whatever platform you're using. It's a highly desirable initiative to engage with. Not only are you encouraging constant sense of ownership of the user group over the templates, you're getting real-time feedback, or biannual feedback, which is near to real-time for most legal teams, on what kind of experiences they have. And things do change, right? So there's always gold to be harvested. It might come back in terms of an upgrade to the playbook, a different positional tweak. It might be that we're losing too much time on a particular clause that maybe we can revisit how we address it. So they're the key, eight key features in terms of a world-class legal template library. In terms of key best practice library design concepts, and by way of a simultaneous wrap-up of the session, we now wanted to give you 15 key principles that should guide you through the creation, operation, and maintenance of your template library. I'm going to cycle through this again quite quickly to get you out on time, or as close to on time as possible. The operating principles are in no particular order. Okay, there are 15 of them. Self-help. When you design your template library, you really need to be encouraging users to think about or engage with self-help resources. So if you're getting lots of questions in there, are you capable of recycling them or put them into an FAQ construct, etc.? Maintenance. A library that isn't maintained is going to be ineffective. So you must build your template library from ground up so that you can maintain it. No one can maintain 200 agreements. The task of maintaining 30 agreements without the sort of technology that I just demonstrated to you is actually, still quite significant. But it can be done if you leverage the concepts that we gave you: a limited number of contractual varietals, long form, short form scenario, and limit, only prepare where your negotiation profile suggests that you should have paper, right? And focus on your build. Design. Leverage everything. Okay, when you're designing your library, you need to leverage limited species, limited contracting scenarios, schedules that are common, tools that are common, etc., etc., etc. MIMO as a principle. You need to put minimum input, maximum output type of design concepts together. And this resonates in tool choice. So, for example, on the question of playbook, do you really need a playbook for every single template that you produce? What about a playbook that focuses on the top 10 commercial clauses that are disputed globally? Okay, they're the same in pretty much every commercial agreement in pretty much every jurisdiction. Now, all of those provisions actually fall within the build. So if you had one playbook which says this is how at our organization, this is what we want, this is the pushback that we anticipate, here are the arguments that we run, you've got a single playbook that for a minimum effort can work across most of your template library. Golden rule, always shoot for the 80%. No more than what's needed as a principle, and only up to 80% of the contracting scenarios that you use. If you want this contract library to really perform, you do need to measure performance. Whenever we upgrade for clients their templates, before we do it, we always ask them to collect baseline data around things like current contract closure times and contract renewals and how many escalations to legal. We also explore ratios of owned to third-party paper and contracts per manager, etc., and costs per contract. User satisfaction. You don't have to do all of these things, but certainly something in terms of contract closure time. You have historic baseline data, and it's so easy to improve these figures with an optimized legal template library. Library size. commented on that multiple times, as small as possible. Always as small as possible. You have to resist the temptation to create one more. For those that remember the movie Gremlins, right? After midnight, a drop of water and these cute little fuddly things just start multiplying. That's what happens to most people's template libraries. One source of the truth, right? The idea of having a centralized build, or rather not the idea, but one of the benefits of having a centralized build and making sure that everybody can access it and making sure everyone knows what to access is that it becomes one source of the truth that people can rely upon. People need to be working with approved assets only. Socialize, right? I gave an example. No point bringing a long form agreement to Indonesia that's 400 pages long, right? You need to socialize it to your market. You need to socialize it to your ecosystem. Don't try and overspec. Don't try and create too many. Keep all the templates as short and clear as possible. We've talked about we've got one source of the truth. We've got single source of the truth amnesty, right? Slightly different point. So one of the phenomena we see inside legal teams is that people start to collect their own little legal precedent database, and it sits on their laptop and it's not centrally accessible. People who I've worked with this document I knew at work. The problem with that is that everybody's using different things, and by using the template you used in the last deal, that was a negotiated document, right? And mistakes and risks can perpetuate and multiply over time. Ownership. Legal teams need to own the best practice template library, but procurement can, is the ultimate client in many cases. Approach to variable data, right? You need to keep legal terms static wherever you can, and in terms of a design feature, wherever you can have variable data sitting in a cover sheet or a particular schedule, go for it, particularly in the PO context. Capture real-time feedback, we've covered that. So, log new issues as they arise, keep a punch list for external updates, recirculate FAQs as and when it's appropriate, and monitor how many times templates have been used each year and each month. Quite often, even with the caution that's sounded in terms of contract numbers, people over include, but when you look at actual data usage, right, they don't justify continued inclusion. So if anything, the size of your template library should be staying static, or potentially, for those that were a little bit over inclusive, reducing. So that's it in a nutshell. The template library is phenomenally important. Most of us don't have it in the condition that we'd like. It's an overwhelming task. The idea of, well, I'd update one provision, then I have to open up 50 agreements and update it there. Most of us don't have templates libraries where they're standardized, that the notification provision is the same in each agreement, that's in the same position, and that by being familiar with one agreement, the user's familiar with all agreements. We've given you some concepts in terms of how to refute the notion that you need too many templates. We know there's only two types, there's long and short ones. We know that if we look at through a vendor relation construct, there's two. There's ones we use one-off, or there's ones we use multiple times, and then there's only 5 varietals of that. We know that 75% of every agreement is essentially the same, okay? So there's a lot of, and we know from negotiation profile, assessment, analysis, we don't need to produce a template for every scenario. So if we leverage those 4 concepts, what we have is the ability to really downscope with confidence the number of documents that we have, but we also have the ability to focus on the root system of the contractual tree, knowing that that is ultimately the most important part that allows us to maintain the trunk and the different types of agreements, which is our analogy for leaves. So if we have any questions, we've just about got you through the session on time. We've got a minute or two to spare, but happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. First question, actually a little bit tough, but the question is, how often should a template library be updated? And how much time would you reasonably dedicate to such updating activities?
Yeah, okay. Well, there's okay, in terms of how often should it be updated, we've given you some hard data on that, okay? And then in terms of how long it would take, well, that's going to be a function of how many agreements you have. But if what we find is that we're able to update our entire library inside of one day, right? And that means canvassing all of the major areas on this book, on this slide here. I'll just give you a small example of how even further efficiencies can be achieved. And I'm not saying this is available to everyone, but if you're using technology, that might also be able to create a whole lot of efficiencies. So I'll just give you a small example. So if I've got this document here, what we're able to do with the templates that we maintain is we don't necessarily maintain 20 templates which are fully unpacked like this with all those clauses. What we're able to do with the software that we use is to actually build provisions. I'm just going to take a clause at random here. I'll plug in. I'll take this clause here. Okay, rejection of deliverables. I'm going to take an acceptance regime. Okay, and I'll take an extension of time provision. So if I now insert those provisions, you can see inside my template, the template will reassemble itself and will only ever draw from that clause. Let me just do it. So if I click expand, right, hey ho, magico, as you can see there, my clauses have automatically just unpacked in the agreement. Now, the implications for maintenance is obviously staggering. Instead of having to go and open up 20, 30, 40 templates, we can just go into our clause bank and we can update 75% of every agreement with one series of keystrokes, and then it propagates through to the entire template library. So there's two answers there. So there's three answers there. For us, we spend a day, right? And we can update absolutely everything, all library collateral. For other organizations, obviously we're technology assisted. For other organizations, that might mean some sort of regulatory landscape monitoring that's needed. It could be opening and closing templates. And it's true that it really does take a long time when you get up and running. However, if your library is harmonized from the outset, then really, it should be, anywhere between 1-2 days per year, but delegated down to, junior members, possibly even a paralegal, once the feedback that in terms of improvements you want to make has been determined by your editorial team. So no clear answer, but using tools and using the principles that we've shared with you in here is obviously a lot faster and massively reduces the maintenance, and you need to do it at least once a year. The more you do it, the less time it takes each time. Anything else, Nick?
Yeah, just one quick follow-on question to that. Lynn asks if we need any special software to insert the clauses like you just did.
Oh, you do, but Lynn, if you buy a cup of coffee each week, then it's about the same cost for that license per month. So put it $80 a year. We use a module from a third-party service provider called MacReview. It doesn't do everything, but it does what I've just showed you. Right, user training would take 90 seconds, and it sits on your SharePoint, so you can put any kind of content on there. If you wanted to see, if I just pull that up again, so here I am. There's my clause bank, right, and inside it, I've got all the legal definitions used inside of the GLS group, and we go and build these for clients. So every organization will have its, or a government authority will have its own nuanced definition vocabulary. So we just build it, and they can draw it for any agreement. There's
actually that links quite nicely to another question that's come through, which is, other than contract templates, are there any other templates that you'd recommend the legal department should have?
Oh, plenty. Okay, so again, we house all of these things in our contracting bank. So, for example, we've got here matter management. So if you look in here, we've got attendance notes, we've got all sorts of documents. So inside standardization is the key to drive legal department efficiency at so many levels. So, for example, if you had a brief to internal client, if you want to brief a junior lawyer, you should have a briefing document which is based around what the most experienced person in the organization thinks you should be asked. So if you can standardize that kind of template and make everybody use it, it's going to have a productivity and performance impact pretty much straight away. What other kind of documents inside the template library, apart from matter management, file management? Well, there are plenty. So contracts typically work associated with and rely on and are impacted by policy documents. So, codes of conduct, privacy policies, anti-bribery and corruption policies, ESG policies, etc. So the template library really will have matter management on the one hand, have legal templates. It'll have, depending on who owns these documents inside your organization, it could also have all those policy asset infrastructures as well. As a team, you'll need to come together and decide what you want. But our recommendation is always just start simple and follow those rules so that it's impossible for people not to find what they're looking for, and it's easy to use, and they have all the support tools. And then you can build on to your library, build a new wing. You've got the history section, then you can build the architecture section, etc.
Oh, great. Thanks very much. We've now crossed the hour, so I think with that, we'll probably draw this webinar to a close. Just a quick reminder to everyone that a recording of this webinar will be published on the GLS website within the next 24 hours, and the slides from the presentation will be circulated to everyone that's attended. So if you do have any friends or colleagues who you think would be interested in this topic, please do point them to the website or share the slides with them. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.